My name is Lisa, and I am part of the Northgate Growth Journey digital team. Welcome to the Northgate Growth Journey. We are so glad that you are here with us today. This is a place for anyone who wants to grow. Enjoy the journey. With every truth we share helps others, driving over 4.4 million impact touchpoints. We have a special heart for the folks in the jail system and their families. If you need help, we are here for you. I want to introduce our CEO and founder, David. We call him the Bible Mentalist, and he has a true heart for people. You can check out his executive bio link in the description box. Before I turn it over to the boss, we have a saying around here. We don't say goodbye, we say, until the trumpet blows. Until then, let's continue to work for him.
Winning was the heartbeat of my life. In San Diego and Pensacola, we had 4 buses packed with people ready to hit the pavement. Through those streets and at those doors, I've personally witnessed thousands of people open their hearts and receive Christ. But times changed. The buses eventually stopped rolling, door-to-door visitation faded, and I watched the entire landscape of soul winning shift up front. Make no mistake, I am 100% for winning souls, but I am deeply concerned about what some preachers are putting out there today. In this podcast, we're looking at what we lost and what we must get back. Turn it up, and I highly encourage you to listen to this twice.
Welcome to the Northgate Growth Journey. I am Steve, and I am joined by Trinity. We are part of the Northgate Growth Journey digital community team.
Hey everyone, it is so great to be here with you all today. And before we jump into the really heavy lifting of today's deep dive, we need to just ground this conversation in what we actually do. CA Jail Outreach is at the heart of our organization. It helps people, especially those with loved ones in the jail system.
Yeah, absolutely. That is exactly where the rubber meets the road for us, connecting with real people in, really difficult circumstances. And this podcast is written by our CEO and founder, David, from CA Jail Outreach.
Right.
Today, we have a very specific and, frankly, I think a deeply impactful mission for this deep dive. We are going to be unpacking David's writings on the biblical mandates of soul winning versus modern traditions.
Which is such a huge topic.
Oh, massive. Specifically, we're looking at how we reach people today without confusing a modern method for a divine law. And for you listening right now, whether you're, on your morning commute or maybe just sitting in your living room, we want to frame this entire conversation around your own spiritual journey.
Yeah, we want you to feel like you're literally the third person in the room with us right now.
Exactly. We're going to untangle some things that have been wrapped up in church culture for decades. So to set the foundation for this whole discussion, I want to begin by sharing the exact sentiments from David's writings.
That's a great place to start.
Yeah, and I'm going to read this directly, precisely as he wrote it, because I think it perfectly captures the heart and the nuance of what we're talking about today.
Go for it.
All right, here's what David writes. This podcast will sit well with others, and I understand that. If you believe in a certain way and it makes you happy, this is great. At the end of the day, everyone's goal is winning souls to Christ. It is important that we get the word out, whether that is door to door or just hanging out on the street. The disagreement arises when a preacher stands on the word of God and claims that their specific method is the only right way, which it is not. For example, preaching that 2x2 house to house is a biblical commandment for evangelism is incorrect. While it is a good method, it is not a direct scriptural command. The only thing the Bible actually says about the 2x2 structure relates to public areas, which I will explain in the podcast. That said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going door to door. It's how the preacher presents the method as a binding law that it becomes unbiblical. I know many good churches have been very successful at going door to door. For example, there is one church that has been around for about 40 years and has reached 4,000 members. Not bad at all, in my opinion. Another church has been around for 25 years and has grown to 15,000 members by using both door-to-door and open public ministry.
What's fascinating here is the incredibly clear distinction David is making right out of the gate.
Yeah.
It is the distinction between a method and a mandate, which, sounds like a simple play on words, but it is actually a vital theological and practical line to draw.
Right. A method versus a mandate.
Exactly. I mean, a method is just a practical, culturally relevant way to accomplish a goal. A mandate is a divine, unchanging law handed down by God. And David is actively validating that the modern door-to-door approach is a great tool.
Right. He literally praises churches that have grown to 4,000 or 15,000 members using it.
Yeah, it has obviously worked for many congregations, but elevating that specific cultural tool to the level of scriptural law, like standing behind a pulpit and saying, God commanded you to do it exactly this way, and if you don't, you are out of the will of God, well, that creates massive, unnecessary burdens on believers.
Oh, absolutely.
And it leads to profound theological inaccuracies.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that distinction is everything. Think about it like fishing.
Okay, I like this.
If the command from the master fisherman is simply, go out and fish to feed the hungry, that is the mandate. The mandate is clear, it's timeless, and it applies to everyone.
Right.
But then imagine a group of fishermen centuries later standing up and declaring that unless you use this one very specific modern brand of graphite fishing rod loaded with a highly specific synthetic line, you are living in disobedience.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
They are taking a modern method, the rod, and trying to claim it is a divine law.
And it gets even more complicated when they try to read that modern method back into ancient history, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like they might even try to retroactively claim that the master fisherman used that exact modern graphite rod, which is, historically and physically impossible.
Right. They didn't have graphite rods 2,000 years ago.
Exactly. The command is to fish. The error is in forcing everyone to use the exact same modern tool and claiming it is a biblical absolute. I mean, imagine forcing someone to wear heavy rubber wading boots in the middle of a blazing desert just because that is what the original fisherman wore.
Right. The gear doesn't match the environment anymore.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense.
That is a brilliant way to look at it. The tension arises when the method becomes the master. When we start judging other believers' faithfulness, not by their genuine love for the lost or their actual fruit, but by whether they are holding that specific graphite fishing rod.
Yeah, that is so true.
It creates a culture of intense legalism rather than a culture of genuine spirit-led outreach. It turns a mission of grace into a compliance checklist.
And that checklist gets really heavy really fast. So this brings up the most logical question. If this 2x2 door-to-door model isn't a direct, literal commandment for walking through modern subdivisions, where did this idea actually originate in the scriptures?
Right, because they didn't just invent it out of thin air.
Exactly. They are pulling it from somewhere in the text.
They absolutely are. And this perfectly segues into examining the actual scriptural texts that people historically used to justify the 2x2 method. We really have to look at the primary evidence in David's writings to see what was actually happening in the dusty reality of the first century, completely apart from how we live today.
So let's look at the actual history. Where does this start?
Well, if we look at David's writings regarding Mark 6, verse 7 and Luke 10, verse 1, we see that Jesus did indeed send his disciples out in pairs.
Right.
First, he sent the 12 apostles, and later, he sent the 70 disciples. The text is very clear that they went out 2 by 2. There's no debating that historical fact.
Okay, so if I'm playing devil's advocate here, just, putting myself in the shoes of someone who has been taught this tradition for 40 years, why pairs?
That's $1 million question.
If it wasn't a formula for knocking on residential doors in modern neighborhoods to pass out church bulletins, why did Jesus specifically structure it that way? I mean, why not send them out one by one to cover twice as much ground? Or why not send them in groups of 5 for maximum impact?
That is the absolute crux of the issue right there. To understand the why, we have to completely strip away our modern 21st century mindset.
Which is hard to do.
It's very hard.
Yeah.
We forget our paved roads, our streetlights, our cell phones, and, 911 emergency services. We have to put ourselves in the dirt, the dust, and the severe danger of ancient Judea.
Right.
David's writings outline 3 very specific logistical and spiritual reasons for this structure. The first is safety and support.
Let's talk deeply about that, because ancient roads were not exactly well-lit interstate highways with rest stops.
Oh, not even close. Traveling in the ancient world was incredibly dangerous. The terrain itself was often treacherous, arid, and completely isolated for miles on end.
Just miles of absolutely nothing.
Yeah. But the biggest threat wasn't just like a twisted ankle. Bandits, robbers, and political zealots were a constant daily threat on these roads. Think of the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Right, the guy who gets beaten, robbed, and left for dead on the road to Jericho.
Exactly. Jesus didn't just invent that scenario out of thin air as a metaphor. That was a very real, terrifying scenario that everyday people feared.
Wow, yeah.
The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was notoriously known as the Way of Blood because of how many travelers were ambushed there. A man traveling alone, carrying whatever meager supplies or coin he had, was an easy, prime target.
So you're saying it was just a massive risk to walk alone.
Huge risk. By sending them in pairs, Jesus was providing fundamental mutual protection. If one fell and was injured, the other could lift him up or bind his wounds. If one was attacked, the other could defend him or run to the next village for help. It was a highly practical, essential security measure for surviving the journey.
That makes total sense. It was about pure survival. It was like a buddy system for a hostile world.
Exactly.
So what is the second reason David outlines?
The second reason is deeply rooted in ancient Jewish culture and law. It is the absolute requirement for a legal witness.
The legal witness.
Yeah. Under ancient Jewish law, specifically Deuteronomy 19, verse 15, a testimony required 2 witnesses to be legally and spiritually valid in the eyes of the community.
Okay, so arriving alone wasn't just dangerous physically. It was dangerous to the message itself.
Precisely. Imagine walking into a dusty Judean town completely alone. You walk up to the town square and you start claiming that the very fabric of the universe has shifted.
Right, you're bringing massive news.
Right. You claim that the long-awaited Messiah has finally arrived, that the kingdom of God is at hand, and that people need to repent immediately. By strict Jewish law, the elders of that town would literally cross their arms, look at you, and say, "Where is your second witness?"
Oh, wow.
Your testimony is legally invalid. You are just a single fanatic making wild claims. One person coming into a town alone could be easily and legally dismissed as a lunatic, a drunk, or a false prophet.
So if I just show up alone in your town saying, I have the absolute truth of the universe, you are not just being stubborn by ignoring me, you are actually following the law by demanding corroboration.
Yes, you are following the law. But when 2 men arrive walking the same road, speaking the exact same radical message, corroborating each other's story without any contradiction under questioning, well, that elevated the message from a mere rumor to a legally binding deposition.
That changes everything.
It does. The elders of the town had to take it seriously, legally speaking. Jesus wasn't giving them a sales strategy for neighborhood canvassing. He was giving them legal immunity and undeniable credibility within the strict confines of a highly legalistic culture.
That is a massive cultural context that we completely miss today. We just read the words 2 by 2, and our brains instantly conjure up an image of 2 guys in matching suits with clipboards standing on a concrete porch in suburbia.
Which is such a modern projection.
It totally is. But in that day, it was a legal deposition happening in real time. It was a court case being presented to a village. And David's writings point out a third reason for the pairs, right? The advanced logistics.
Yes, the advanced logistics. In Luke 10, verse 1, the 70 were essentially sent as an advance team. The text explicitly says Jesus sent them before his face into every city and place whither he himself would come.
Okay.
Jesus knew his time on earth before the crucifixion was incredibly short, and he was purposefully moving toward Jerusalem. He simply didn't have the time to spend weeks in every single village breaking up the hard spiritual hole.
Right. The clock was ticking.
Exactly. So he sent these 35 pairs ahead of him to prepare specific towns for his impending arrival. They laid the groundwork, they announced the kingdom, they cast out devils, and they healed the sick. So when Jesus finally arrived physically, the town was already buzzing, primed, and ready to receive him.
Wow.
It was a brilliant, strategic, logistical masterclass in event preparation.
And here is the crucial observation from David's writings that we absolutely cannot miss. When you look at all 3 of those reasons, safety from bandits, legal requirements for a Jewish witness, and logistical advance work, the 2 by 2 structure had absolutely nothing to do with the actual mechanism of a human soul getting saved.
That is so important to emphasize. I am so glad you brought that up.
It's vital because salvation comes through hearing the gospel, right? Romans 10 verse 17 tells us, "So then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God." It does not say faith cometh by hearing 2 people simultaneously on your porch.
Right.
The message of the gospel is what saves, whether that message is delivered by one person in a quiet room, 2 people on a dirt road, or shouted by one man to a crowd of 5,000 on a hillside. The power is in the word, not the head count of the messengers.
And David's writings provide irrefutable evidence of this from the scriptures themselves. If 2 by 2 was a binding divine law for how a soul must be saved, then the early church constantly broke it, and Jesus himself broke it. Think about the monumental examples of single soul winning in the New Testament. In John chapter 4, Jesus is completely alone with the Samaritan woman at the well.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
The disciples had literally left to go buy food. There is no second witness there. He ministers to her individually, one-on-one, and her life is completely transformed. She then goes back and evangelizes her whole city.
Wow, yes. Jesus didn't wait for Peter to get back with the bread before he started witnessing to her.
Exactly. Or consider Philip in Acts chapter 8. The Spirit of God explicitly sends Philip alone out into the harsh desert to meet the Ethiopian eunuch who is riding in a chariot. Philip alone runs up to the chariot, Philip alone explains the scripture from Isaiah, and the eunuch believes and is baptized.
All by himself.
All by himself. Or look at Peter in Acts chapter 10, who is called alone to the house of Cornelius, a Roman centurion, to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. In all these monumental, paradigm-shifting moments of salvation in the early church, it was one-on-one.
You know, I was thinking about this earlier, and extending that workplace safety analogy really crystallizes this for me.
Yeah.
Let's take the hard hat on a construction site. Wearing a hard hat on a first-century construction site makes perfect sense. The bandits and rugged terrain are the equivalent of falling rocks and swinging beams.
Absolutely.
It is highly recommended. It is smart policy to keep the worker alive. But imagine walking into a modern homeowners association neighborhood today, where the physical dangers of bandits are completely gone. But you are demanding that everyone still wear the heavy plastic hard hat while walking down the sidewalk, simply because that is how Peter did it.
It just looks silly.
It isn't just unnecessary. It looks faintly ridiculous to the outside world. The hazard changed, so the safety gear should too. The building stands or falls based on the foundation. The gospel, not on the hard hat. The 2x2 structure protected the workers, but the gospel is what saves the soul.
That is a perfect extension of the analogy. We have taken a practical safety and logistical measure meant to protect the laborers from getting murdered on the road, and we have twisted it into a mystical, mandatory formula for the listener's salvation.
Right. So if 2x2 was about travel safety, legal credibility, and logistics, then where in the world did the house-to-house part of this modern tradition come from?
Yeah, that's the next big piece.
Because we hear that phrase hyphenated all the time. 2x2, house-to-house. If the pairs were just for the journey, what were they doing when they actually got to the towns? Let's look at the ancient culture of homes versus public spaces.
Let's do it, because this completely flips the modern narrative on its head.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at the justification for the modern door-knocking method, people almost always point to the book of Acts. Specifically, Acts 20, verse 20, where the Apostle Paul says he taught publicly and from house to house.
Right.
And they also point to Acts 5, verse 42, which says, "And daily in the temple and in every house, they cease not to teach and preach Jesus Christ." On the surface, if you were just reading that in modern English with a modern mind for it, that sounds exactly like walking down a sidewalk, carrying a stack of tracts, and knocking on every front door on the block.
It does sound exactly like that, until you look at the original language and the historical context. David's writings unpack the Greek term used in Acts 20, verse 20, which is kata oikon.
Kata oikon.
Yeah. We have to deeply understand that this phrase meant holding fellowship, breaking bread, and teaching inside the private homes of existing believers. We are talking about the early house churches.
Oh, wow.
The early Christians didn't have massive tax-exempt cathedral buildings with steeples. They were a persecuted minority. They met in the homes of the brethren.
Wait, hold on. So Paul wasn't cold calling strangers in Ephesus?
Absolutely not. He was visiting the elders, teaching the saints, confirming the new disciples, and sharing meals in the specific spaces where they were already gathering to worship. Right. It meant moving from the house of one believer on Tuesday to the house of another believer on Thursday to conduct ministry and deep fellowship. It did not mean walking up to the door of an uninvited wealthy Roman stranger who practiced paganism, knocking on their heavy wooden gate, and launching into a 3-minute religious presentation.
That makes so much more sense. And David's writings bring up a fascinating, almost shocking detail regarding the House of Peace strategy from Luke 10, verses 5 through 7.
Yes, I love this part.
This is when Jesus sent those 70 out. He actually gave them instructions that directly, explicitly contradict the modern idea of canvassing a neighborhood door by door.
Completely contradicts it.
He told them, "And into whatsoever house ye enter, first say, Peace be to this house." And then he explicitly instructed them, and I want you listening to really hear this. He said, "And in the same house remain, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the laborer is worthy of his hire. Go not from house to house.
Go not from house to house. That is a staggering contrast to the modern method. It is the exact opposite of what many visitation programs mandate today.
I am genuinely struggling with this. I grew up in a church culture where if you weren't hitting every single door on the block until your knuckles were sore, you were considered lazy.
Right, you were slacking.
Yeah, you weren't doing the work. You were telling me Jesus expressly forbade the very thing modern churches mandate. How do we reconcile that? Why wouldn't they just go hit every door to maximize their reach?
To reconcile it, we have to do a deep dive into ancient architecture and sociology, which is so revealing.
Okay, let's go there.
We have to completely erase the image of the American suburban street. Wipe away the neatly lined driveways, the manicured front lawns, the welcoming little front porches with the decorative welcome mats and the lit doorbells.
Right, none of that existed.
That concept did not exist in the first century. In the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman world, the architecture of a home was designed for extreme privacy and heavy security. Private homes were heavily walled off. They were clustered around private, internal, open-air courtyards. The outside of a house facing the public street was often just a blank, solid stone or mud brick wall with a single, heavy, locked gate.
So you couldn't even see the front door, as we know it today. There were no windows facing the street to wave at your neighbors.
Exactly. The living spaces were entirely internal, facing inward to the courtyard for safety from thieves and for thermal cooling. Walking up to a stranger's enclosed, fortified home, uninvited, and violently pounding on their heavy outer gate was not just culturally awkward, it was considered highly intrusive, deeply suspicious, and potentially very dangerous for the person knocking.
That sounds like a great way to get yourself in serious trouble.
It was. You would instantly be viewed as a threat, a thief, or an invader. Jesus knew this,
Right.
So he told his disciples to find a single base of operations in that town. A house of peace, a host who is receptive to the message and willing to offer hospitality and to set up camp there. Let the community come to you through natural relational networks. He explicitly forbade them from bouncing around from door to door in the village because it would have destroyed their witness and made them look like wandering vagrants or criminals.
That is just incredible. So if they weren't knocking on these heavy outer walls of private fortresses, where in the world were they meeting the unsaved people? How did the church grow so fast if they weren't doing neighborhood blisses?
They went to the Agora. The Agora was the public market, the massive open-air square in the dead center of the city. Contrast the extreme paranoid privacy of the ancient home with the vibrant, chaotic, completely open reality of the public square.
And David's writings point to Acts 17, verse 17, where Paul is in Athens. The text says, "Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews, and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him."
Precisely. The market is the Agora. People in the ancient world spent almost all of their daylight hours out in the public square.
Because their homes were so closed off.
Exactly. That is where all commerce happened, where local politics were fiercely debated, where news from other cities were shared, where legal trials were held, and where philosophers and teachers naturally gathered to share new ideas. Because their homes were private, fortified, and often small, dark, and hot during the day, the entire social life of the city happened outdoors in these massive communal spaces.
So the early disciples simply met people where they naturally, organically gathered. They didn't have grid-style subdivisions to walk through, and even if they did, the culture of the home was completely closed off.
Right.
They went to the marketplace because that is where the crowds already were. The modern practice of canvassing residential neighborhoods is truly a reflection of our current isolated housing culture, particularly post-World War II American culture. It is an adaptation. It is not a replica of New Testament history.
That is the essential takeaway. It is an adaptation to a specific era of our modern world, but it is an era that is rapidly ending.
And that adaptation leads us to a massive collision course today. We have talked about the historical mismatch, but there is a deeply human modern element here too. How does that historical reality, the biblical principle of meeting people where they naturally gather, clash with the physical, psychological, and legal realities of modern subdivisions today? Because the world has changed drastically even in just the last 20 years.
It has changed profoundly. And this is where the fierce insistence on turning a cultural method into a divine mandate really starts to cause unnecessary friction, both for the church and for the public.
So what does this all mean for us right now, today? If the true biblical command is to reach people where they are, How does the modern, strictly enforced door-to-door method actually hold up logically in today's society?
To understand that, we need to look at the staggering statistical data presented in David's writings. We aren't just talking about a few nice people knocking on doors on a sunny Saturday morning in a small town.
Right, it's bigger than that.
Much bigger. We are talking about a massive, nationwide, and even global enterprise of religious solicitation. David's research notes that there are an estimated 1.3 to 2 billion religious knocks generated annually.
Billion, with a B. That is an astronomical, almost incomprehensible number of interruptions.
It is. Now consider that there are roughly 149 million individual homes in the United States. If you average that out mathematically, it means roughly 9 to 13 knocks per home every single year.
Wait, 9 to 13? That means the average American family is having their privacy interrupted uninvited nearly once a month by someone trying to hand them literature, pitch a religious message, or invite them to a service.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the psychology of that for a second. We live in an era of digital exhaustion. People are working longer hours. They are constantly bombarded by emails, texts, and news alerts. The home has transitioned from the 1950s concept of an open-door neighborhood hub to the 2020s concept of a fortress of solitude.
That is so true. It's our only safe space.
It is the last remaining sanctuary where you can just be left alone. When someone breaches that sanctuary uninvited once a month, it creates an incredible amount of fatigue, annoyance, and even hostility in the general public.
And the public response to that deep fatigue is highly visible. The data shows that 22 to 30 million doorsteps in the U.S. now feature no soliciting signs. People are actively, intentionally, and legally trying to put up a physical barrier to this specific method. They are opting out.
And it goes far beyond just buying a plastic sign from a hardware store and sticking it next to the doorbell. Let's detail the Homeowners Association, or HOA, reality.
Oh, this is a huge factor.
Yeah, David's writings point out that an estimated 45% of HOAs completely legally ban solicitation of any kind, and another 30% heavily restrict it with extreme vetting processes. We're talking about nearly 75% of governed communities actively saying collectively, do not come knocking on our doors or we will call the police.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us to reflect on a very profound insight from David's writings. Think about the sovereignty of God here. Perhaps God, in his infinite wisdom, knew that this specific method would eventually become a major legal and cultural barrier.
What do you mean by that? Unpack that for me.
Think about it logically. If God had actually commanded in the scriptures, thou shalt literally knock on the wooden door of every private residence in the world, then we as believers would have absolutely no choice but to do it, regardless of the laws, the friction, or the cultural hostility.
Right, we just have to obey and face the consequences.
Exactly, we would have to be arrested for it gladly. But because some churches treated a modern cultural method as an absolute divine law, people have unnecessarily taken these issues all the way to the civil courts.
Wow.
They have spent millions of dollars, tied up resources, and spent decades fighting bitter legal battles against cities and HOAs just for the right to walk into a subdivision and knock on doors. They believed with all their hearts they were defending the faith. But what if they were just defending a tradition?
That is a chilling thought. Fighting a massive cultural and legal war, alienating the very community you're trying to reach over a method that wasn't even commanded in the first place. It is like fighting to the death to defend the graphite fishing rod while the fish are swimming somewhere else entirely.
Exactly.
But wait, I have to push back here because I know someone listening is undoubtedly thinking of Luke 14, verse 23. It is the classic verse used for this. It says, "And the Lord said unto the servant, Go out into the highways and hedges and compel them to come in that my house may be filled." Doesn't the phrase compel them to come in justify aggressive, relentless door knocking? Doesn't it mean we should be pushing past the no soliciting signs and kicking down doors if we have to save their souls?
It is a verse that is heavily used to justify high-pressure, aggressive tactics. But we have to clarify what David's writings show regarding the actual context of that verse. Context is everything.
Right.
That verse is not a literal, logistical, step-by-step handbook for neighborhood canvassing. It is a quote from a parable, specifically the parable of the Great Supper or the wedding feast.
Right. The story where the wealthy man throws a massive feast, but all the originally invited elite guests make ridiculous excuses and refuse to come.
Exactly. The master of the house gets angry at their rejection, and he tells his servant to go out to the streets and lanes of the city and eventually out to the rural highways and hedges to bring in the poor, the maimed, the halt, and the blind.
Okay, so what does that actually mean?
Theologically, this parable is deeply symbolic. It symbolizes God's grace extending beyond the religious elite of Israel who rejected the Messiah, outward to the outcasts of society, and eventually all the way out to the Gentiles. It is a beautiful, expansive picture of the radical inclusivity of God's invitation to salvation.
So to take a deeply symbolic, beautiful parable about the grace of God extending to the broken Gentiles and arbitrarily strip it of that rich theological meaning just to create a physical binding mandate for canvassing modern HOA-governed subdivisions.
Yeah.
That is massive theological overreach.
It is an incredible overreach. It is taking a poetic illustration of radical grace and turning it into a heavy legalistic club to beat your congregation with. When you realize that the divine command is to spread the gospel, not to force a specific mid-20th century American visitation model onto every culture and era, it frees you.
I can see that.
It completely liberates the church to pivot. If the physical doors of a neighborhood are legally closed, we don't have to fight a 10-year court battle to pry them open. We can just go find where the people are actually gathering today.
Which brings us directly to the underlying risks of elevating a method to a mandate and how it impacts the true heart of ministry. Because this isn't just a debate about logistics or history or HOAs, it is a debate about the soul of the church itself.
Exactly. This is where it gets highly personal.
We have talked about the historical mismatch, but there is a deeply psychological element here. Let's look at the cynical versus the sincere realities of modern visitation programs as detailed in David's writings. Because there are two very different things happening simultaneously in the church world when it comes to this, and we have to be honest about both.
We absolutely must acknowledge the sincere believers first because they are the majority. There are countless men and women, teenagers and grandparents who go out knocking on doors every weekend out of a genuine burning evangelistic zeal.
Right, they really mean well.
They do. They truly love the Lord. They truly believe people need the gospel, and they are willing to face slammed doors, rolled eyes, and outright rejection because of that deep love. Their hearts are in exactly the right place. Their motives are pure, and God honors that profound sincerity.
Yes, the boots on the ground are almost always driven by pure motives. But David's writings highlight the subtle underlying risk at the institutional level. When a church forces a first-century logistical tool into a 21st century subdivision, it creates immense friction.
A lot of friction.
And to justify pushing through that friction, you have to track it. You have to prove it works. And once you start putting up giant whiteboards in the church staff room to track doors knocks, tracts handed out, doorstep decisions made, and visitors brought in.
Yeah.
Doesn't that completely alter the psychology of the person knocking?
It really does.
The program can slowly and silently shift from a messy ministry of grace into a highly polished corporate marketing funnel designed to recruit financial tithers.
And that is the cynical reality that breaks the heart of the mission. When the primary metric of success becomes raw numbers rather than genuine, slow spiritual transformation, the human being standing on the other side of that door ceases to be a complex soul in desperate need of a savior and subtly becomes a prospect in a sales funnel.
Wow, yeah.
They become a notch on a belt. The whole endeavor becomes about sustaining the institution rather than healing the broken.
I want to ask you, the listener, a direct question right now. Think about your own experiences in your spiritual journey, whether you have been the one knocking or the one answering. Does tracking metrics ever distract from the actual human being standing in front of you?
That's a powerful question.
Have you ever been part of an outreach where you felt the intense pressure to get a decision quickly, to push someone through a customized prayer in 60 seconds, just so you could go back and report a success on the whiteboard? Have you ever felt that rush to close the deal rather than actually taking the time to listen to the deep, messy, complicated pain in that person's life?
Yeah.
When we treat a rigid method as a divine mandate, we almost always prioritize the completion of the method over the care of the person.
That is the tragic irony of legalism. In our absolute zeal to fulfill a perceived law, we can entirely miss the actual heart of Christ. We have to recenter this entire conversation on the actual, unchanging biblical commands. What did God actually mandate? If it wasn't a specific method of transportation or architecture, what is the core?
David's writings ground us right back in the text, where we need to be. The true responsibility is to win souls, to preach the gospel, and to actively help others.
Let's look at the actual verses that define the mandate. Proverbs 11, verse 30 says, "The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he that winneth souls is wise." Mark 16, verse 15 says, "And he said unto them, Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And crucially, importantly, Galatians 6 verse 2 says, bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ.
Bear ye one another's burdens. I want to sit with that for a second. Bearing a burden does not usually happen in a 60-second memorized pitch on a concrete porch to a stranger who is desperately trying to get back to their dinner.
No, it doesn't.
Bearing a burden is heavy. It requires time, it requires proximity, it requires deep relationship, and it requires a willingness to get your hands dirty in someone else's mess.
This raises an important question. If true, relational soul winning is truly the goal, what is the actual mission of the church? The mission is beautifully simple. Get them saved, deeply care for them, disciple them, and trust God completely to take care of the church finances.
Yes.
So many of these massive, metric-driven, high-pressure programs are subtly fueled by an unspoken institutional fear that if we don't market ourselves aggressively enough, if we don't hit our visitation quotas, the church will fail financially. We end up relying on human programs and corporate strategies to secure tithers, rather than trusting the Lord of the harvest to provide for his own bride.
The command isn't about where to go specifically. The Bible doesn't say go strictly to the front door of residential homes, nor does it say go strictly to the Agora as a rigid, inflexible law for all time. The command is to go teach and reach people exactly where they are naturally gathering today. If they are gathering online and digital communities, reach them there. If you're at the local community center or the dog park, reach them there. If you meet them at a coffee shop or in a deeply impactful jail outreach program like CA Jail Outreach, reach them there. It is about dynamically adapting the method to fulfill the unchanging mandate.
It is about spiritual agility. When we drop the heavy, restrictive armor of legalistic tradition, when we take off the wading boots in the desert, we are finally free, light, and ready to run the race God actually set before us in our own generation.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought from David's writings to mull over in the quiet moments of your day. We have dismantled a lot of tradition today, but let's build something better.
Yeah, let's build on truth.
If we stripped away all our modern metrics, the dry erase tracking boards, the institutional logistics, and the heavy pressure of performing a specific, outdated method, what would it actually look like for you to simply find the Agora, the natural gathering space in your own daily life this week?
I love that.
Who is the person naturally in your path at work, at the gym, or in your neighborhood? And what would it look like for you to put down the clipboard, sit with them, simply bear their burden, and share the truth and love?
That is the true calling, finding your Agora.
Thank you, CA Jail Outreach, for hosting the podcast and for your dedication to sharing hope and truth.
We encourage you to explore their work via the link in the description.
Please thank our boss and keep him in your prayers for sharing his heart.
Until the trumpet blows, wishing you a fantastic day.
Thank you for listening. David often tells us that people will love this podcast, though there are always those who will say it is not the Bible, those who say it goes against the church, and those who say it goes against a man of God. Then there are the folks who simply enjoy the knowledge. Just remember, no one controls you except God and the Bible. Everything else is simply a tool that God has put in place for us to reach out and grab when we need help. People vote leaders in and out of the church and the government. When we are out of the will of God, so are the church and the government. We pay everyone's bills using God's money that He has provided to us. Once we grasp these simple concepts, we can better serve the kingdom and the people who need help. Until then, let us keep serving Him. Find someone today, hand a gift card to a random stranger, and tell them God loves you. Check out all the latest updates, website links, and resources in the podcast description box below. Have a great day.